Welcome students to the final video for the course. I had two different requests for this video, and instead of making two videos, I realized that they actually combine well. So I had a request to go deeper into issues of race and immigration, and I had a request to look at migrant identity and then to look at it actually in relationship to the arts. So I'm doing immigration, race, and identity. The photo you have there is of an indigenous woman, and that's very important when we look at Latin American immigration, and so we'll get to that in a few minutes. So I'm taking some of this from a book that I've just finished reading. Rebecca Radio wrote it. It's called Cuidado Pastoral, Ministerio con Inmigrantes. And none of what I'm sharing with you from that book is new for me. It's all, they are all concepts that I know very well from experience, from being part of the community and from ministering in the immigrant community for 40 years. But it's nice to have it documented and well laid out, and that's what Rebecca Radio does in her book. Unfortunately, it's in Spanish, but if you read some Spanish, it's really worth the read. So she talks about loss, limbo, and loneliness, that every immigrant suffers loss, that you leave behind the country of your origin, you leave behind the places that you knew and felt that you belonged in. So that element of loss is greater or less. It's obviously greater for refugees than it is for people who immigrate with more of a sense of choice, but it's there for everyone, and it's defining. And often, particularly if you experience your migration as forced, that you have quite a bit of survivor guilt, that you walk around with that guilt because you've left people behind. Rebecca Radio uses the descriptor visible, invisible people. And she's talking here primarily about immigrants of color, but she says that they are visible in the larger US society, certainly, and in Europe as well, that they are visible, and yet they are invisible because they are not seen as themselves. They are seen as migrant, so they are seen as representations of the other. And so she talks about what it does psychologically and spiritually to someone to be visible, invisible. And then, of course, immigrants are in limbo. They live in limbo, because they never, the vast majority of immigrants never feel fully part of the new world, but they're also never able to return to the old world because the old world has already changed from when they left, and they have changed. So there is no possibility of real return. You could go forward back to your country of origin, but you can never return to what you've left. She also talks about burdens and betrayal, that you carry the people with you that are back home. And of course, remittances, which is the money that's sent back home, is a major part of the economy of several countries. So the home country depends on the remittances that come back from the immigrants. So, you know, one of the dynamics that we've run into in the work that we've done with families seeking asylum is that they need to save money in order to be able to make a place in this world, but it's very, very hard for them to save money. I mean, even to save up enough to pay first and last and rent, because they feel compelled to send the money back to people who are still in danger, who are still in terrible poverty. So that's a real tension. And then the other reality is that burden is much harder to carry because they're used to the support of an extended family. They're used to not bearing their burdens alone. And so that dynamic of having more of a burden than the people around you have or can see without the support of an extended family is a very strong part of the migrant experience and the migrant identity. Then the second question is that migrants, or the second aspect that we need to lift up here of betrayal, is that betrayal is a regular part of the migrant experience and the migrant identity, because people welcome you, and they welcome you as part of a script. And the script is that they are helping you or rescuing you, and you dang well better perform according to expectations. Because if you don't, if you're the bad child rather than the good child, you can be thrown out. You can be evicted. They can turn on you. So the experience of betrayal is a regular experience. It becomes part of the migrant identity to be suspicious. And also migrants don't always treat each other well. That there's a phenomena in abused children that abused children have a higher likelihood of abusing their own children if they don't process it, if they don't heal well. And the same thing happens, that migrants exploit newcomers. So you can't even trust people who aren't necessarily from your country. At the same time, let's not ignore that there are benefits to migration. And here I want to introduce you to the work of Daniel Orlando Alvarez, which is really fascinating. He focuses on the phenomena of hybridization. Now, hybridization is a term that comes from the world of biology, and it talks about how two different biological species come together, or I don't know if species is the right word, two different classifications come together, and they don't just combine their characteristics, something new is created. And he's not the only one, of course, who talks about hybridization and migration, that happens, in fact, in migration, that the culture of the old country and the culture of the new country combine in that person, not just so that they create a mix of the cultures, but that, in fact, that they create something new, which is then a gift to their new home. And Daniel Orlando Alvarez specifically focuses on the role of the Holy Spirit in the hybridization process. So I read him mostly in Spanish, but I understand that he writes in English as well. So if you're curious about the gift of hybridization in migrants and how that forms migrant identity, that Daniel Orlando Alvarez's work is well worth reading. So now I want to talk a little bit about Latin America because it's what I know best. I don't pretend that I can talk about race in the fullness of the way that race in terms of Asian migrants or race around African migrants. I have certain observations, but I don't have a lot of knowledge. So I'm going to share with you more knowledge about Latin American immigrants and race, and then how that impacts questions of race and migration in the United States. And I would just, maybe this would be a case study that then could help you to study the phenomena with other communities. So in Latin America, very different from the United States, most people are mixed. A common saying is that our father raped our mother, but they both live inside us. So I want you to imagine, those of you who are born and raised in the U.S., what it would be like if everyone in the U.S. had a significant amount of Indian blood. That would change the U.S., right? It would change the way people thought about themselves, the way they thought about each other, the way they thought about the country. However, that doesn't mean that there's no racism in Latin America. Sometimes Latin Americans will claim that, but it's not true. There's a controversy around mestizaje, and mestizaje is a word that describes that combination of the Spaniard and the indigenous person, or the Spaniard and the Indian. However, blancamiento means that mestizaje is seen as a gift because and this is historic, this goes back to the 19th century, because it makes indigenous people whiter. So, of course, that's very controversial in the 21st century. It's often referred to as colorism. So my cuñada, my sister-in-law, who was actually quite dark herself, because we often have ranges within a family from, más moreno, which means darker, to más güero, which means lighter. So we have ranges within a family. She's one of the darker members of our family. But when my daughter was born and I brought her home from the hospital, she was so delighted because she said, "Look how güera she is." This same sister-in-law, we had two dogs, and one of them had black fur and the other one had light brown fur, and she liked the dog better with light brown fur because She said he was more güero, which is pretty ridiculous. But I think that's, I think that that's how profound this blancamiento phenomena is, how deeply integrated it is into the Latin American psyche. So there is racism in Latin America, even though it is significantly different because everyone, or the vast majority of people, not everyone, but the vast majority of Latin Americans identify to some extent as mestizaje. Now, another aspect of the Latin American experience that is very different is that we had wars of independence in which darker-skinned people fought off lighter-skinned people. So I want, again, imagine if you were born and raised in the US, if we had actually had a revolution where darker-skinned people came up against lighter-skinned people and won. So, again, think about how that changes the psyche. At the same time, lighter-skinned people did not stop having an enormous impact, maybe even a controlling impact in Latin America. So we have this paradox. We had wars of independence that were successful, but it still left a ruling class that was mostly lighter-skinned. You do have people from Africa in Latin America. You have people who are called mulatto, which means that they really, it's a form of mestizaje, but it's a form of mestizaje that specifically includes African blood. And of course, a more modern term would be Afro-Latinx. So, and there, depending on which country you're looking at in Latin America, you're looking at significantly different numbers of people who have African descent, and you're looking at significantly different histories. There are countries where slavery happened, there are countries where slavery never happened, or let me say where slavery was indigenous people, not people from Africa. And there are indigenous and Black movements for justice in Latin America. Those movements are often mixed movements because people of African descent in Latin America relate to indigenous people in Latin America much more closely. And a major issue for everyone is always land, because in the conquista, in the conquering of Latin America by the Spaniards, a few families took the vast majority of the land in most countries. And so land reform is an ongoing issue. Now, I realize I didn't say that, again, one of the subtle differences is that Latin Americans are proud of their indigenous national identity, even if indigenous people are actually discriminated against on a pretty much daily basis on every level. But there's a sense that that's what separates them from the European world or the world of the US or Canada, is that we are countries that pride ourselves on our indigenous heritage. So these are interesting paradoxes in the psyche of people from Latin America who immigrate to the United States. Now, if you want to read more about race in Latin America, Peter Wade wrote the classic book on it, and it's been redone recently. So if you want to read more, that's a good place to start. There's a lot of additional work as well. Most of the people in Latin America, ironically, who've written about race in Latin America are lighter skinned. So in the US, so intersectionalism in the US, so people come from this, what I've been describing, and how do they see race in the United States? Now, in the Southwest of the US, people from Mexico were often treated very similarly to the way that African Americans are treated. So historically, so there were anti-miscegenation laws that you couldn't marry, Mexicans couldn't marry white people, which of course was a very strange experience for Mexicans because miscegenation are us, right? So what do we even do with that? But and of course there were multiple barriers to equal treatment, there were lynchings, and to date there are still microaggressions. One of the most common microaggressions that was described in a recent Pew study, which I've cited there, is the assumption that we're stupid. And I want to say that I'm very light-skinned and I've had that experience. So that somehow people from Latin America are not as smart as people in the United States. And there, of course, the darker skin you are, the more you have experiences of racism and discrimination in the United States. So there's ethnicity and there's race, and they combine in interesting ways. There is on the same Pew study, there is a major concern around a little over a third of people of Latin American descent in the United States feel like there isn't enough attention to racism against people of Latin American descent. So that's an interesting factor as we try to work together across racial lines, is that there's some real resentment, some sense that our pain is not seen. There's also, so I think, some real recognition, particularly among young Latinx, that our pain is not equal, that ethnicity and race are not exactly the same thing, and that it really is people of darker skin that experience more racism, even if you're Latinx. So we have talked previously in the class about the various forms of intersectionalism, so I'm not going to go back into that. What I'm doing instead is giving a real foundation for understanding the way that sort of the components that feed into intersectionalism and the barriers to intersectionalism. So the last thing, I was asked to talk about identity and art. Now, in Latin America, again, talking about the migrants who I know best, in Latin America, art is publicly, the value of art is publicly recognized in ways that it hasn't always been and isn't often in the United States. So governments subsidize art. Whole communities paint murals together on a regular basis. It's a form of community memory making. So if you drive around the city of San Salvador, graffiti is not painted over, and graffiti is mostly beautiful. It's spontaneous mural making. So it's not gang graffiti in the same way, although sometimes there's gang graffiti integrated into it, but nobody paints over murals. Communities paint murals. Now, some of that has been carried into movements in the United States, and I'm not an authority in any way on this, but this is a picture of Chicano Park, it's in San Diego near the border, and it was a major site of Chicano resistance when I was young, and it's got murals everywhere. It's under a freeway. So if you ever have a chance to see Chicano Park, it's well worth seeing and experiencing. It's a very powerful experience. So I've loved being with all of you in class, and we do have one more session, which I'm suggesting we sort of do as a synchronized session / Christmas party. So we'll, if you come to that, we'll talk about what I mean by that. But if you don't come, I just want you to know how much I've enjoyed being with you all. So thank you.